The surgical light blazed overhead like an interrogation lamp as Dr. Benjamin Waters made the first incision into Harold Mitchell's palm, the scalpel meeting resistance that shouldn't exist in human flesh. 73 years of weathered skin parted to reveal something that made the entire surgical team freeze mid-breath. "Jesus Christ," whispered the nurse. A fragment of metal, no bigger than a quarter, emerged from tissue that had grown around it like a shrine. Etched letters, faded but unmistakable. D. Sullivan, 1968. Harold's eyes flooded. 55 years of carrying the dead, and now Danny wanted to speak. The fragment clinked against the surgical tray, the same sound as dog tags hitting jungle mud when his best friend took the bullet meant for him. Outside, autumn rain hammered the hospital windows exactly like monsoon rain in the Mekong Delta. The day promises were made that couldn't be kept. Some wounds don't heal. They just wait their turn. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Harold Mitchell had been carrying secrets longer than most folks carried marriages. At 73, he moved through his Springfield, Missouri ranch house like a ghost haunting his own life, each footstep echoing in rooms that once buzzed with Margaret's laughter and their children's chaos. 2 years since cancer took his wife, and the silence still felt like punishment. The dark lump in his palm had been his companion for 6 months now, growing from pea-sized to quarter-sized, from whisper to shout. He'd hidden it from his 3 grown children with the same stubborn pride that had kept him from talking about Vietnam for half a century. Robert, his eldest at 51, was a cardiologist in Kansas City, too smart for his own good, always probing with those doctor eyes. Linda, 48 and fierce as her mother, taught elementary school in Springfield and visited twice weekly with casseroles and interrogations. Thomas, the baby at 45, ran the auto shop downtown and inherited Harold's talent for keeping engines running and emotions buried. "Dad, you're favoring that hand again," Linda had said last Sunday, her teacher's voice sharp with concern. She'd been arranging Margaret's roses, the ones Harold couldn't bring himself to tend anymore. "Just arthritis, honey," he'd lied, the same way he'd been lying about phantom pains and midnight sweats for 55 years. The lump pulsed now like a second heartbeat, angry and insistent. Sometimes, in the pre-dawn darkness, Harold swore he could hear Danny Sullivan's voice echoing from that jungle hell. "Promise me, Harry. Tell Sarah I love her. Tell her about the baby." 55 years of broken promises had calcified into this tumor of guilt, this physical manifestation of everything Harold had failed to do when he came home and Danny didn't. Sarah Sullivan, now Sarah Morrison according to his one Google search, lived in Buffalo, New York, remarried 6 months after Danny died, had a good life, raised Danny's son, became a grandmother. Harold had convinced himself that showing up on her doorstep would be selfish, would tear open wounds that had healed without him. Dr. Benjamin Waters was nothing like the VA doctors Harold remembered, those tired men who'd prescribed silence and whiskey for what they called soldier's heart. Waters was 52, silver-haired, with gentle hands and the kind of patience that came from understanding. His father had served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home different, died young from what they now called PTSD, but then called weakness. "Mr. Mitchell," Waters had said during Harold's reluctant examination, "this mass has been with you for decades. The tissue growth patterns suggest trauma, something foreign your body's been trying to expel. We need to operate." Harold stared out the clinic window at the autumn leaves surrendering to gravity. Everything fell, eventually. Leaves, soldiers, promises. But some things he was learning took 55 years to hit the ground. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, when October fog hung over Springfield like cigarette smoke in a foxhole. Harold had been sitting at Margaret's kitchen table, staring at the untouched breakfast she would have forced him to eat, when Dr. Waters delivered the verdict that would crack his carefully constructed silence wide open. "Harold, we need to schedule that surgery soon." Waters' voice carried the weight of medical certainty mixed with something else, understanding maybe, or recognition. "This isn't something we can wait on anymore. The mass is showing signs of movement, trying to work its way to the surface. Your body's been fighting this for decades, and it's tired." Harold's free hand trembled as he reached for Margaret's coffee mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Mom" that none of them had the heart to throw away. "How soon we talking, Doc? This week? Friday, if you can manage it. I want to do this as an outpatient procedure, local anesthetic." "You'll be awake, but you won't feel anything." Waters paused, and Harold could hear papers shuffling. "Harold, I have to ask, do you have any idea what this might be?" The imaging suggests a foreign object, something metallic. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, and for a moment Harold was 20 years old again, crouched in elephant grass with Danny Sullivan beside him, both of them trying to breathe quietly, while Charlie moved through the jungle like death in black pajamas. The taste of fear was copper and salt, same as the taste filling his mouth now. "I might have an idea," Harold said finally. Within an hour, his phone started ringing. Robert first, his doctor son's voice tight with controlled panic. "Dad, Doctor, Waters called me. Why didn't you tell us about this mass? I'm a cardiologist, for Christ's sake. I could have..." "Could have what, son? Made it go away?" "Some things can't be fixed with medicine." Linda arrived before lunch, bursting through the front door like she had when she was 12 and afraid of thunderstorms. "Daddy, what's happening? Robert says you need surgery and you've been hiding this from us for months." Her eyes were Margaret's eyes, green and fierce and seeing too much. "It's nothing, sweetheart, just old man problems." "Bullshit." The word hung in the air like a slap. Linda never cursed, had made her own children put quarters in a swear jar for years. "This is about Vietnam, isn't it? It's always about Vietnam with you." Thomas showed up after closing the shop, motor oil still under his fingernails, looking like Harold had at 25, tall, stubborn, carrying the weight of things he couldn't fix. "What's this about surgery, Pop? Linda's been crying all afternoon." They sat in Margaret's living room, 3 middle-aged children suddenly small again, waiting for their father to explain the unexplainable. Harold looked at the mantelpiece where Margaret had displayed their family photos. Graduations, weddings, grandchildren's first steps, a whole life built on the foundation of his silence. "There's something in my hand," he said finally. "Something that's been there since 1968. The silence stretched like a tripwire. Robert leaned forward, his doctor training kicking in. "Something? What kind of something? Metal? Shrapnel?" "A piece of a man I couldn't save." Linda's breath caught. She'd been trying to get Harold to talk about the war for 30 years, prodding gently during Sunday dinners, leaving books about Vietnam veterans on his coffee table. "Dad, please, talk to us." Harold stood and walked to the window, watching the fog swirl around Margaret's rose garden. The roses were dying now, black spot and neglect claiming what love had once protected. His name was Danny Sullivan, 20 years old, from Buffalo. "Had a pregnant wife named Sarah. Used to show me her picture every damn day." His voice cracked like ice on a February pond. "He saved my life and I let him die." "That's not how war works, Pop." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "You know that. I made him a promise." Harold turned back to face his children, and for the first time in 55 years, he let them see the broken boy he'd hidden behind the father mask. "I promised him I'd tell his wife he loved her. Tell her about how he talked about their baby every night. How he was going to teach the kid to throw a curveball and ride a bike and be a better man than his old man ever was." The room felt smaller suddenly, thick with decades of unspoken grief. "So why didn't you?" Robert asked. And there was no judgment in it, just the simple question of a son trying to understand his father. Harold looked down at his palm where the lump pulsed like a guilty conscience. "Because I was a coward. And now it's too late." Friday morning couldn't come soon enough, and it couldn't come slow enough. Friday morning arrived wrapped in the kind of crisp October air that made Harold think of Thanksgiving and Margaret's pumpkin pie and all the things that used to matter before the world got complicated. He sat in the pre-op room at Springfield Regional Medical Center, wearing a hospital gown that made him feel small and vulnerable, like a child in his father's work shirt. Robert paced the small room like a caged animal, his cardiologist training warring with his son instincts. "Dad, I still think we should get a second opinion. This could be anything: calcified scar tissue, a benign tumor, hell, maybe just arthritis forming around an old injury." "It's not arthritis, son." Harold flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar weight of his secret shifting beneath the skin. "I know what this is." Linda sat in the plastic chair beside his bed, holding his free hand with the desperate grip of someone afraid of losing the last parent she had. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, though she'd tried to hide it with makeup that couldn't quite cover the fear. "Daddy, whatever comes out of there, whatever you've been carrying, we're going to deal with it together, as a family." Thomas stood by the window, his mechanic's hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders tense with the weight of waiting. He'd always been the quiet one, the one who fixed things with his hands instead of words, and Harold could see him struggling with a problem that couldn't be solved with tools and elbow grease. Dr. Waters entered with the confident stride of a surgeon who'd spent 30 years cutting into human mysteries. But Harold caught something different in his eyes today. A recognition, maybe, or the kind of understanding that came from growing up in the shadow of someone else's war. "Good morning, Harold." "Ready to see what you've been carrying all these years?" "As ready as a man can be, I suppose." The operating room was smaller than Harold had expected, white and sterile and humming with the quiet efficiency of modern medicine. They positioned him on the table, his left hand extended and prepped, the dark mass visible beneath skin that had grown thin with age. Dr. Waters worked with methodical precision, injecting local anesthetic until Harold's palm felt like it belonged to someone else. "I want you to stay awake for this," Waters said, adjusting the surgical light. "If this is what I think it might be, you deserve to see it come out." Harold nodded, watching the ceiling tiles and thinking about another kind of light. Muzzle flash in jungle darkness, the harsh glare of flares dropping like dying stars over the Mekong Delta. His children waited in the family room, probably holding their breath, probably praying to the God that Harold had stopped talking to sometime around 1968. The first incision was precise, a straight line through skin that had kept secrets for more than half a century. Harold felt pressure but no pain, watched his own blood well up and get suctioned away by efficient hands. The surgical nurse, a young woman who reminded him of Linda at 25, stood ready with instruments that gleamed under the lights. "There," Waters said, his voice tight with concentration. "I can see it." Harold lifted his head slightly, straining to glimpse what his body had been harboring. Through the small opening in his palm, he could make out something dark and metallic surrounded by scar tissue that had formed around it like a pearl around sand. Waters worked carefully, his instruments probing and separating tissue that had grown together like old lovers who couldn't let go. The mass shifted, moved, began to emerge into the light like a reluctant truth finally forced to speak. "Jesus Christ," whispered the surgical nurse, her professional composure cracking. The fragment that came free was roughly triangular, about the size of a quarter, darkened with age, but unmistakably metallic. Waters held it up to the light, and Harold's vision blurred as 55 years collapsed into this single moment of recognition. Etched into the metal, faded but still legible, were the words, "D. Sullivan, 1968. The surgical room went silent except for the steady beep of monitors and Harold's ragged breathing. Waters set the fragment in a small metal dish, where it clinked with the finality of a gavel or a coffin nail, or the last word in an argument that had lasted too long. "My God," Waters said quietly. "This is a piece of a dog tag, isn't it?" Harold couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The fragment sat in that sterile dish like an accusation, like evidence in a trial that had been going on in his heart for half a century. Danny Sullivan's name, carved in metal and carried in flesh, a promise broken, and a friend mourned, and a guilt so deep it had literally grown roots. The tears came without permission, hot and shameful, and 55 years overdue. "Danny," he whispered, the name emerging like a prayer or a confession or both. "Oh, Danny, I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." Waters looked up from cleaning the wound, his eyes bright with understanding. "This belonged to someone important to you. He saved my life." Harold's voice cracked like a teenage boy's, raw with emotion he'd kept buried since Johnson was president and the Beatles were still together. April 15th, 1968. Ambush outside Can Tho. He pushed me down, took the rounds meant for me, his dog tags. They were right there when the grenade went off. "Must have caught a piece of shrapnel, sent it right into my palm." The surgical nurse was crying now, tears dripping onto her mask. Waters continued suturing with steady hands, but Harold could see the emotion in his shoulders, the careful way he was handling this moment that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the weight of carrying the dead. "You've been carrying him all this time," Waters said softly. Harold nodded, watching his friend's name gleam under the surgical lights. 55 years, 4 months, and 11 days. The fragment looked smaller now, outside his body, just a piece of metal with a name on it. But Harold knew the weight of it, knew it had been heavy enough to bend his spine and break his heart and keep him awake on nights when the rain sounded like gunfire. Danny Sullivan was finally free. The recovery room felt like a confessional, white walls and whispered conversations, and the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Harold lay propped against pillows, his left hand wrapped in gauze that felt lighter than air compared to the burden he'd carried for 55 years. The fragment sat in a small plastic container on the bedside table, Danny Sullivan's name catching the afternoon light like a prayer. Robert sat in the corner chair, his medical training warring with his role as a son. He'd seen the fragment, heard the story, watched his father break apart in front of strangers who suddenly felt like family. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us? All these years we thought you just didn't want to talk about the war." "Didn't know how to start," Harold said, his voice hoarse from crying. "Your mother tried to get me to talk, especially after Thomas was born. But how do you explain to your children that their father's a coward? That he came home when better men didn't?" Linda moved closer to the bed, her teacher's instincts kicking in. She'd spent 30 years getting children to open up about their fears and hurts, and she recognized the signs of a wounded soul trying to heal. "Daddy, carrying guilt for 55 years doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human." Thomas had been quiet since the surgery, standing by the window like he was guarding against something none of them could see. Finally, he turned around and his face was Margaret's face, stubborn and loving and unwilling to accept bullshit from anyone, especially family. "Pop, what was his name? Danny's wife?" "Sarah. Sarah Sullivan." Harold closed his eyes, remembering a photograph worn soft from handling, a young woman with dark hair and Danny's eyes, smiling at the camera like she had all the time in the world. She was 19 when he shipped out. Pregnant with their first baby. "Do you know what happened to her?" Robert asked. his doctor's mind already working the problem. Harold had wondered the same thing for decades, had even driven to Buffalo once in 1975, sat in his car outside the address from Danny's letters, watched a woman who might have been Sarah hanging laundry in a backyard where children played. But he'd driven away without knocking, convinced that his guilt would only poison whatever peace she'd found. "She remarried," he said finally. "6 months after Danny died. I looked her up once, years ago. Found out she became Sarah Morrison. Had a good life, raised Danny's boy. Probably better off without me showing up with my war stories and my broken promises." Dr. Waters knocked and entered carrying a folder thick with papers and the kind of expression that suggested he'd been thinking hard about something. "Harold, I've been doing some research on your friend, Danny Sullivan. There are resources now, databases, ways to track families of fallen soldiers, if you're interested." The room went quiet except for the steady hum of hospital machinery and the distant sound of life going on outside the windows. Harold stared at the fragment in its plastic container, Danny's name a constant accusation and invitation both. "She doesn't want to hear from me," Harold said. "It's been 55 years, Doc. She's moved on, built a life. What am I supposed to say? Sorry I never called, but I had a piece of your dead husband in my hand, and I was too much of a coward to give it back." Waters pulled up a chair, settling into it with the easy confidence of someone who'd delivered both good news and bad news often enough to know the difference. "Harold, can I tell you something about my father?" Harold nodded, sensing a story that mattered. "He served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home in 1971. Never talked about it, never dealt with it, drank himself to death by the time I was 15. Waters leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I spent my whole childhood wondering what happened over there, what broke him so completely that he couldn't find his way back to us. It wasn't until after he died that I found his letters home, his journals, the names of men he'd served with." The silence stretched like a held breath. "Point is, Harold, the families of the fallen, we all carry pieces of that war. Sarah Sullivan Morrison has been wondering about her husband's last days for 55 years. You have answers she needs even if you don't think you do." Linda reached over and took Harold's good hand. "Daddy, what would Mom want you to do?" The question hit like a physical blow. Margaret had always been the brave one in their marriage, the one who faced problems head-on, while Harold preferred to bury them deep and hope they'd stay buried. She'd known about his nightmares, his drinking years, the way he'd wake up sometimes calling Danny's name. But she'd never pushed, had loved him through his silence the way only Margaret could. "She'd want me to keep the promise," Harold said finally. The decision, once made, felt like stepping off a cliff. Robert used his medical connections to track down Sarah Sullivan Morrison's contact information. She was 75 now, still living in Buffalo, still carrying the name of the man she'd married 6 months after Danny died. Thomas offered to drive, his steady mechanic's hands better suited for long roads than Harold's shaking fingers. Linda insisted on coming along, armed with tissues and the kind of maternal instincts that knew when someone needed mothering. They left Springfield on a Sunday morning in November, the fragment riding in Harold's shirt pocket like a talisman or a weapon, he wasn't sure which. The drive to Buffalo took 8 hours through countryside that looked like Margaret's quilts, all patchwork fields and autumn colors bleeding into winter gray. Harold had called ahead, his voice shaking as he explained to the woman who answered the phone that he was a veteran who'd served with her first husband, that he had something that belonged to her family. Sarah Morrison's voice had been cautious, polite, with the careful tone of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected phone calls from strangers claiming connection to her past. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate you calling, but I'm not sure what you could have that would interest me. Danny died so long ago, and I've moved on with my life. Ma'am, I know this sounds strange, but I've been carrying a piece of your husband with me for 55 years, literally carrying it. And I think it's time I gave it back." The pause that followed was long enough for Harold to wonder if she'd hung up, long enough for him to question everything about this foolish mission. Finally, her voice came back, smaller and more vulnerable. "What kind of piece?" "Part of his dog tag. It's a long story, Mrs. Morrison. But if you'll let me, I'd like to tell it to you in person." Buffalo felt like the end of the world when they finally arrived. Gray November sky pressing down on a city that had seen better days. Lake Erie stretching to the horizon like an inland sea. Sarah Morrison lived in a modest two-story house in a neighborhood where the American flag still flew, and the lawns were kept neat despite the encroaching urban decay. Harold stood on her front porch with his children flanking him like bodyguards, the fragment warm in his pocket and his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The door opened before he could knock, and suddenly he was face to face with the woman Danny Sullivan had loved enough to die dreaming about. She was smaller than he'd imagined, gray-haired and fragile-looking, but her eyes were still the same eyes from Danny's worn photograph, dark and intelligent and carrying their own weight of years. Behind her stood a man Harold's age, tall and solid with Danny's jawline and the kind of presence that suggested he'd grown up knowing he had big shoes to fill. "Mr. Mitchell?" Sarah's voice was steadier than it had been on the phone, but Harold could hear the tremor underneath the politeness. "Yes, ma'am. This is my son Robert, and my daughter Linda, and my boy Thomas." Harold's voice cracked like a teenager's. 55 years of imagined conversations suddenly meaningless in the face of this moment. "And this belongs to your family." He pulled the plastic container from his pocket, Danny's name visible through the clear sides, and watched Sarah Morrison's face crumble like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Sarah Morrison's legs gave way like a building losing its foundation. Her son, Michael, Harold realized, Danny's boy, grown into a man with his father's eyes and jaw, caught her before she could fall, his strong hands gentle as he guided her to the porch chair that had probably held 3 generations of morning coffee and evening contemplation. "Mom, are you okay?" Michael's voice carried the controlled panic of someone who'd spent 54 years protecting a woman from a past that kept trying to resurface. His eyes never left Harold, studying him with the suspicious intensity of a man who'd grown up hearing fragments of a story that never quite made sense. Sarah stared at the plastic container in Harold's trembling hands, her face cycling through emotions like weather over the lake. Shock, recognition, anger, grief, something that might have been relief. "How?" she whispered. "How do you have this?" Harold felt his own knees wobble, felt Linda's steadying hand on his elbow and Robert's medical training kicking in as his son stepped closer, ready to catch him if he fell. "Ma'am, could we sit down somewhere? This is a long story and I'm not as steady as I used to be." Michael looked like he wanted to slam the door to protect his mother from whatever pain this stranger had brought to their doorstep. But Sarah raised a shaking hand, her teacher's authority still strong despite the tremor in her voice. "No, Michael. Let them in. I've been waiting 55 years for someone to tell me what really happened to your father." The Morrison house smelled like apple pie and old memories, the kind of place where family photos covered every surface and Afghans draped every chair. Sarah led them to a living room dominated by a brick fireplace and a mantelpiece that Harold realized was a shrine to Danny Sullivan, his military portrait in dress blues, smaller snapshots of him in jungle fatigues, a folded flag in a triangular case that had probably been delivered by solemn men in uniform who spoke in careful euphemisms about sacrifice and service. "Sit, please." Sarah said, her politeness a thin veneer over the storm Harold could see building in her eyes. "Michael, get the coffee on, and call your wife. Tell her we'll be late for dinner." Michael hesitated in the doorway, torn between obedience and protection. "Mom, maybe I should stay. These people could be—" "They could be what, honey?" "Scam artists who somehow got hold of a piece of your father's dog tag and drove 8 hours from Missouri to— what exactly?" "Con money out of a retired school teacher?" Sarah's voice carried the snap of someone who'd spent 30 years managing classrooms full of children and wouldn't be intimidated by grown men with secrets. "Get the coffee, Michael, and bring down that box from my closet, the one marked Danny." Harold settled into a chair that had probably been Danny's father-in-law's, felt the weight of 55 years pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible pack. The fragment sat on the coffee table between them, Danny's name catching the late afternoon light streaming through windows that overlooked a backyard where children's toys suggested grandchildren and the kind of life that grows up around absence. "Tell me," Sarah said simply. So Harold told her, started with April 15th, 1968, and worked backward and forward through memory and guilt and the weight of promises that felt too heavy to keep. He told her about the ambush outside Cantho, about Danny pushing him behind the fallen tree, about the grenade that sent shrapnel flying like deadly confetti. He told her about Danny's last words, about the promise extracted with blood and witnessed by a jungle that kept its own secrets. "He talked about you every night," Harold said, his voice breaking like ice in spring. "Showed me your picture so many times. I thought I knew you. Told me about the baby coming, how he was going to teach the kid to throw a curveball and fix engines and be a better man than he'd ever been." Sarah's hands were pressed against her mouth, tears streaming between her fingers. Michael had returned with coffee. None of them would drink, standing behind his mother's chair like a sentinel guarding against an invasion of grief that was 55 years overdue. "He loved you," Harold continued, the words Danny had made him promise to say finally finding their way into the light. "Last thing he said was, 'Tell Sarah I love her. Tell her I'll be waiting for her and the baby in heaven, and when we're all together again I'll teach them both to dance.'" The silence that followed was broken only by Sarah's sobbing and the steady tick of a grandfather clock that had probably measured out decades of loneliness and questions that nobody could answer. Michael's face had gone pale, his jaw working like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. "Why?" Sarah finally managed, looking up at Harold with eyes that held 55 years of accumulated hurt. "Why didn't you come before? Why wait until now?" It was the question Harold had been dreading, the one that cut to the bone of his own cowardice and shame. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I came home and Danny didn't, and I didn't know how to face the wife of a better man." "Because you remarried so quick, and I thought maybe you were better off without reminders of what you'd lost." "Quick?" Sarah's voice rose like a slap. "Quick? I was 19 years old, 6 months pregnant, with no money and no family and a government that gave me a flag and a pension that wouldn't cover rent. I married Paul Morrison because Michael needed a father, and I needed someone to help me survive. Not because I stopped loving Danny, you self-righteous bastard, because love doesn't pay bills or change diapers or explain to a little boy why his real daddy isn't coming home." The room felt smaller suddenly, thick with accusations and justifications and the kind of truth that cuts both ways. Harold felt his children tense behind him, felt Robert's doctor training warring with his son instincts, felt Linda's maternal fury building like a thunderstorm. "Mom," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime spent as the bridge between his mother's first love and her second marriage, "maybe we should—" "No!" Sarah stood up, pacing to the mantelpiece where Danny's portrait watched over them all like a judgment. 55 years, Mr. Mitchell. 55 years. I've wondered how he died, whether he suffered, whether he thought about us at the end. 55 years of partial answers and government letters that told me nothing, and dreams where he came home and explained why he had to leave. She turned back to face Harold, and he saw the young woman from Danny's photograph blazing through the aged features, fierce and beautiful and unbroken despite everything life had thrown at her. You had answers, Mr. Mitchell. You had his last words, his final thoughts, the closure I needed to say goodbye properly, and you kept them because you were afraid of an uncomfortable conversation. Because you thought I was better off not knowing? Harold felt the weight of her anger like a physical blow, felt the truth of it settling into his bones like lead. Yes, he said simply, and I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an old fire, acrid and unavoidable. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with the effort of breathing around 55 years of suppressed grief and fury. Then she sat back down, suddenly small and fragile again, the fight draining out of her like air from a punctured balloon. "Show me," she said quietly. "Show me exactly where it came from." Harold unwrapped the gauze from his left palm, revealing the neat sutures and the small scar that marked where Danny Sullivan had finally been set free. Sarah studied the wound with the clinical attention of someone who'd bandaged countless playground injuries and kissed away decades of childhood hurts. "It was right there," Harold said, pointing to the center of his palm. "For 55 years, 4 months and 16 days. My body grew around it like it was trying to keep him safe." Sarah reached out and touched the edge of the bandage, her fingers gentle against skin that had carried her husband's memory in the most literal way possible. "He was waiting," she whispered. "All this time, he was waiting for me to know." Outside, November wind rattled the windows and scattered leaves across the yard like confetti at a funeral. Inside, 4 adults and their collective children sat with the weight of decades between them, holding pieces of a story that was finally being told in full. Michael Morrison had heard fragments of his father's story his entire life, scattered pieces delivered in whispers between his mother and stepfather, incomplete answers to childhood questions that always seemed to make the adults in the room uncomfortable. But sitting in his mother's living room, watching her hold a piece of metal that had lived inside another man's body for longer than Michael had been alive, he felt the careful architecture of his understanding begin to crumble. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice carrying the strain of someone trying to process the impossible. "You never told me Dad had a best friend who survived. You never told me someone else was there when he died." Sarah looked up from the fragment, her eyes red-rimmed but clearer than they'd been in years. "Because I didn't know, honey. The Army told me he died in combat, that's all." No details, no witnesses, just a telegram that said, "Regret to inform," and a flag that couldn't answer questions. "But you could have found out." Michael's voice was rising, his careful control starting to fray around the edges. "You could have asked, could have written letters, could have..." "Could have what?" Sarah snapped, the teacher's authority blazing through her grief. "This was 1968, Michael. There was no internet, no Google, no databases of fallen soldiers. The Army didn't hand out contact lists of survivors. They gave you a folded flag and a pension check and told you to move on with your life." Harold watched the family drama unfold with the sick recognition of someone who'd helped create a crisis he couldn't fix. His own children sat like statues, trapped between loyalty to their father and recognition of the pain he'd caused. Linda kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues from her purse, her teacher's instincts recognizing the signs of a family in emotional crisis. "I tried," Sarah continued, her voice breaking like glass under pressure. "God help me, I tried to find out more. I wrote letters to the Pentagon, to his commanding officer, to other families in his unit. Most never wrote back. The ones who did, they gave me form letters about honor and sacrifice and serving with distinction. Nobody mentioned Harold Mitchell. Because I was in a VA hospital, Harold said quietly, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. I came home in June of '68, but I wasn't right. PTSD, they call it now. Back then, they called it combat fatigue or shell shock or just plain crazy. The room went silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the sound of someone's coffee growing cold. Robert leaned forward, his medical training engaged despite the emotional chaos around him. Dad, you were hospitalized. For how long? 2.5 years. Harold's voice was barely above a whisper. Off and on. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the drinking. Your mother stuck by me, but I was gone for a long time. Lost years, the doctors called them. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the backyard where his own children played on weekends, where 3 generations of family dinners had celebrated birthdays and holidays and all the small victories that make up a life. So while my mother was raising me alone, while she was working 2 jobs and crying herself to sleep every night, you were getting help. You were in a hospital where people cared about your problems. Michael, that's not fair, Linda interjected, her voice gentle but firm. Mental illness isn't a choice. PTSD isn't something you just get over. Fair? Michael whirled around, his face flushed with 54 years of accumulated questions and resentments. You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been my mother knowing how my father died. Fair would have been her getting the closure she needed instead of spending decades wondering if he suffered, if he was afraid, if he thought about us at the end. Thomas, who'd been silent since they entered the house, finally spoke up. She's right, though. Pop was sick, really sick. I remember him from when I was little. The nightmares, the drinking, the way he'd disappear into himself for days at a time. Mom used to send us to Grandma's house when it got bad. And that excuse is 55 years of silence? Michael's voice cracked like a whip. That excuse is letting my mother carry this alone? Sarah stood up slowly, moving between her son and the strangers who'd brought both answers and accusations into her carefully ordered life. Stop it, Michael. Just stop. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing classrooms full of emotional teenagers and wouldn't tolerate it in her own living room. But Mom... No buts? Yes, I'm angry. Yes, I'm hurt. Yes, 55 years is too long to wait for closure. But look at him, honey. She gestured toward Harold, who sat hunched in his chair like a man waiting for sentencing. Look at what this has cost him. You think he's been living easy all these years? You think carrying this guilt has been some kind of vacation? Harold felt the weight of her defense like a physical blow, unexpected kindness from the woman he'd failed in the most fundamental way possible. Mrs. Morrison, you don't need to... Yes, I do. Sarah's voice was steel-wrapped in silk, the tone she'd used with difficult parents and stubborn administrators for 30 years. Because my son is hurting, and hurt people say cruel things they don't mean, and because you're hurting too, and you've been hurting for longer than any of us. She moved to the mantelpiece, picking up Danny's military portrait and holding it like a shield against the emotional chaos filling her living room. You want to know what would have been fair, Michael? Fair would have been Danny coming home. Fair would have been him teaching you to throw a curveball and walking me down the aisle at our 20th anniversary and bouncing his grandchildren on his knee. Her voice broke, but she kept going, driven by something deeper than grief. A mother's need to protect, even when the person who needed protecting was the man who'd caused the pain. Fair would have been a world where 20-year-old boys didn't die in jungles on the other side of the world fighting a war nobody understood for reasons nobody could explain. But that's not the world we got, honey. We got this world, where good men carry pieces of their dead friends for 55 years, and mothers raise children alone and families spend decades wondering about answers that never come. Michael slumped against the window, his anger deflating like a punctured balloon. I needed someone to blame, Mom, for all of it. For Dad being gone, for you being sad, for Paul never being able to fill the hole Danny left behind. I know, baby, I know. Sarah set down the portrait and moved to her son, pulling his head down to her shoulder the way she'd done when he was small and the world seemed too big and scary to navigate alone. But blame doesn't bring him back, and it doesn't change what happened. All we can do is decide what happens next. Harold watched the embrace with the hollow recognition of someone who'd spent 55 years running from exactly this kind of moment, the raw honesty of grief shared, the possibility of forgiveness offered but not demanded. His own children sat frozen, caught between their father's pain and the Morrison family's crisis, unsure whether they were witnesses or participants in this long overdue reckoning. I should go, Harold said finally, starting to rise from his chair. I've caused enough pain for one day. Sit down, Sarah said firmly, not releasing her hold on Michael, but turning to fix Harold with the kind of look that had kept 30 years of students in line. You don't get to run away again, Mr. Mitchell. You came here to keep a promise, and we're not done yet. She guided Michael back to his chair, then returned to her own seat, picking up the fragment that had started this emotional avalanche. You said Danny had last words. You said he wanted me to know something specific. I want to hear it all. Every word, every detail, everything you remember about that day. Harold felt his throat close, felt the weight of 55 years pressing down on his chest like earth on a coffin. Ma'am, some things might be better left. No. The word cut through the air like a blade. No more protecting me from the truth, no more deciding what I can and can't handle. I'm a 75-year-old woman who buried one husband and nursed another through cancer and raised a son who never knew his father. I think I can handle whatever Danny Sullivan wanted me to know. Outside, darkness was falling over Buffalo, streetlights beginning to flicker on like candles in a cathedral. Inside, 6 people sat with the accumulated weight of decades between them, finally ready to hear the whole truth about love and loss and the promises we make to the dying. Harold took a shaking breath and began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of 55 years of silence finally broken. It was 04:30 hours, April 15th, 1968. We were on patrol outside Cantho, 12 men moving through elephant grass that was taller than we were. Danny was point man that day, always volunteered for the dangerous jobs, said somebody had to do it and it might as well be someone with something to live for. Sarah gripped the fragment tighter, her knuckles white against the darkened metal. Michael had stopped pacing, drawn back to his chair by the gravity of his father's story finally being told in full. We'd been out there for 6 days, looking for a North Vietnamese supply route that intelligence said was moving weapons through our sector. Hot as hell, humid as a steam bath, and every step felt like walking into an oven. Danny kept showing me your picture, Mrs. Morrison. Had it tucked inside his helmet liner, wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. Harold's voice cracked, but he pushed through, driven by something deeper than obligation. The need to finally deliver a message that had been burning inside him for more than half a century. He talked about you every chance he got. Said you were the prettiest girl in Buffalo, smartest too. Said you were going to be a teacher. We're going to change the world one classroom at a time. And the baby. Harold's eyes filled with tears. God, how he talked about that baby. Had it all planned out. Was going to teach the kid to throw a curveball, take them fishing on Lake Erie, show them how to change a tire and balance a checkbook and all the things his own daddy never taught him. Michael leaned forward, his earlier anger replaced by desperate hunger for details about the father he'd never known. What else did he say? About me? Said if you were a boy, he was going to name you Michael, after his grandfather, who came over from Ireland with nothing but the clothes on his back and built a life with his bare hands. Said if you were a girl, he'd name you Margaret, after his mother, who died when he was 12, but who taught him that being strong meant being gentle. The room felt sacred suddenly, filled with the presence of the dead and the weight of words that had waited too long to be spoken. Linda was crying openly now, her tissues forgotten, as she listened to her father deliver a message across 5 decades of silence. The ambush came out of nowhere, Harold continued, his voice steadying as he fell into the rhythm of memory. Automatic weapons fire from 3 sides, mortars dropping like rain. Danny saw the muzzle flash before I did, threw himself on top of me, pushed me behind a fallen tree trunk that probably saved both our lives. For about 30 seconds, Sarah closed her eyes, but Harold could see her lips moving silently, perhaps praying or perhaps just trying to breathe around the weight of finally knowing. There were 12 of us when the shooting started. After the first minute, there were maybe 6 still moving. Danny and I were pinned down behind that log, and he was hit, took a round through the shoulder that should have sent him to the rear, but he just wrapped it with a field dressing and kept shooting. Harold paused, remembering the taste of cordite and fear, the way time stretched and compressed in combat until seconds felt like hours and hours passed like heartbeats. Then came the grenade. Heard it hit the ground maybe 10 feet away, heard Danny curse in Irish, something his grandmother taught him, he said. And then Harold's voice broke completely, but he forced himself to continue. Then he was on top of me again, covering me with his body, telling me to stay down, telling me he loved Sarah and the baby, and if something happened to him, I had to promise to tell them. The grandfather clock in the corner marked time with mechanical precision, but Harold felt like he was back in that jungle, watching his best friend make the last choice he'd ever make. The grenade went off, shrapnel everywhere, hot metal flying like angry wasps. Danny took most of it in the back, but a piece of his dog tag, must have been right at chest level when the blast hit, caught me in the palm, went deep, right through the skin, and my hand closed around it like it was trying to protect something precious. Harold held up his bandaged palm, the wound that had finally released Danny Sullivan after 55 years of captivity. He was still conscious when the medics got to us, still talking, still trying to make me promise. "Tell Sarah," he kept saying. "Tell Sarah I love her. Tell her the baby's going to be beautiful and smart and strong like her. Tell her I'll be waiting in heaven, and when we're all together again, I'll teach them both to dance like my grandmother taught me." Sarah was sobbing now, great heaving cries that seemed to come from someplace deeper than grief, from the abandoned girl who'd needed to hear these words for 55 years, from the mother who'd raised a son with questions she couldn't answer, from the woman who'd built a life on the foundation of incomplete goodbye. "Those were his last words?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Harold said, and something in his tone made everyone in the room lean forward. "No, there was more. Something I never told anyone, not even the Army investigators, not even your mother when she married me." Robert sat forward in his chair, his medical training recognizing the signs of someone about to reveal something that had been eating them alive for decades. "He made me promise something else," Harold continued, his voice so quiet they had to strain to hear him. "Made me swear on my mother's grave that I'd look after you both. Said if something happened to him, I was to come home and find you and make sure you were okay. Said family takes care of family, and we were brothers now, blood brothers. And that made me responsible." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stopped crying, stopped breathing, stared at Harold with an expression that cycled through shock and understanding, and something that might have been relief or might have been rage. "Responsible," she repeated slowly. "He made you promise to look after us." "Yes, ma'am." "And instead, You spent 2.5 years in a VA hospital and then built a life in Missouri and never once tried to contact us." Harold felt the accusation like a physical blow, felt the weight of his failure settling into his bones like lead. "I tried, Mrs. Morrison. God help me, I tried. When I got out of the hospital in 1971, first thing I did was drive to Buffalo. Sat outside your house for 3 hours, working up the courage to knock on your door." "What house?" Michael asked sharply. "Elm Street. Little blue house with white shutters, big maple tree in the front yard. You were playing in the backyard, maybe 3 years old, dark hair like your mother, running around with a dog that looked like it was half German Shepherd, half something that could fly." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "That was our first house. Paul and I bought it right after we got married. Rex was our dog. We had to put him down when Michael was 7. I saw you hanging laundry," Harold continued, his voice thick with memory. "Saw a man come out of the house, tall guy, good-looking, wearing work clothes like he'd just gotten home from a job. Saw him kiss you, saw him pick up the boy and swing him around like fathers do." The pieces of the story were falling into place now, 55 years of assumptions and misunderstandings finally revealing their true shape. "And you decided we were better off without you," Sarah said, and there was no anger in it now, just the weary recognition of someone who understood the weight of impossible choices. "I decided I was a broken man with nothing to offer except guilt and nightmares and stories about your dead husband. You looked happy, Mrs. Morrison. You looked like you'd found peace. And I was afraid I'd destroy that." Michael stood up again, but this time not in anger, in recognition, in understanding of the impossible position his father's death had put everyone in. "So you went back to Missouri." "So I went back to Missouri. Met Margaret 6 months later, married her a year after that, built a life, raised children, tried to forget. But I never forgot the promise. Never stopped feeling like I'd failed your father, failed you, failed everything that mattered." Thomas spoke for the first time in an hour, his voice gentle with the kind of understanding that comes from growing up watching someone carry invisible weight. "That's why you never talked about the war, isn't it, Pop? Not just because of what you saw, but because of what you didn't do." Harold nodded, feeling decades of shame and self-recrimination finally finding their way into the light. "Every 4th of July, every Veterans Day, every time someone thanked me for my service, I wanted to tell them the truth, that I came home and Danny didn't, that I made a promise I was too much of a coward to keep, that I spent 55 years carrying a piece of a better man and doing nothing with it." Sarah stood up slowly, moving to where Harold sat hunched in his chair like a man waiting for judgment. She knelt beside him, taking his unbandaged hand in both of hers, and looked up into his eyes with an expression that held 55 years of grief and understanding and something that might have been forgiveness. "Harold Mitchell," she said softly, "you kept your promise. Maybe not the way Danny intended, maybe not the way any of us would have chosen, but you kept it. You carried him home, and now you've brought him back to us." The silence that followed Sarah's words felt sacred, like the hush inside a cathedral where prayers have soaked into stone and time moves differently than it does in the outside world. Harold stared down at Sarah's hands holding his, unable to comprehend the grace being offered after 55 years of carrying condemnation like a stone in his chest. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. "I failed him. I failed you. I failed that little boy playing in your backyard who grew up without knowing his father loved him enough to die for strangers." Sarah's grip tightened, her teacher's hands strong from decades of guiding children through their darkest moments. "Harold, look at me." When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, she continued with the gentle authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime helping people find their way through grief. "Danny didn't die for strangers. He died for his brothers. He died for you. And you've spent 55 years honoring that sacrifice by carrying the weight of it. Michael moved closer, his earlier anger transformed into something deeper. The recognition of a son finally understanding the full cost of his father's heroism. "Tell me about him," he said quietly. "Not about how he died, but about how he lived. What was he like?" Harold felt something shift inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for decades, finally creaking open. He was the best of us, always sharing his rations when someone was hungry, always volunteering for the dangerous jobs, always writing letters home when the rest of us were too tired or too scared to think about anything but surviving. The room seemed to warm as Harold's voice grew stronger, memory overcoming the paralysis of guilt. He had this laugh, infectious, could make you laugh even when you were scared out of your mind. And he was smart, book smart, but street smart too. Could read people, could tell when someone was about to break before they knew it themselves. Linda leaned forward, her maternal instincts recognizing the healing power of shared stories. "What did you two talk about? Besides home, I mean." "Everything. Music. He loved Motown, could sing every Temptations song ever recorded. Baseball. He was a Pirates fan, said Roberto Clemente was the greatest player who ever lived. Cars. He knew engines like I knew. Well, like I thought I knew war." Harold's voice carried the ghost of laughter, the first joy he'd allowed himself when thinking about Danny Sullivan in 55 years. "He sounds wonderful," Sarah said softly, tears flowing freely, but no longer from pain alone. "Like the boy I fell in love with, but grown up. Strong." Robert, who'd been quiet throughout the evening, finally spoke up. "Dad, what happened after you came back from Buffalo that day? After you saw Mrs. Morrison with her new family?" Harold's face darkened, the brief moment of lightness fading like sunset into night. "I drove back to Missouri and tried to drink away the memory of that happy family. Your mother found me 3 days later, passed out in my car in the parking lot of the American Legion Hall. That's when she made me choose. Get help or lose her." "She saved your life," Thomas observed. "Margaret saved everything worth saving about me," Harold agreed. "But she couldn't save me from the dreams, from the guilt, from the feeling that I was living someone else's life. Danny should have come home to raise his son, to love his wife, to build the life he talked about every night in that jungle. Instead, I got to do all those things, and he got a flag and a hole in the ground." Michael stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, picking up his father's military portrait and studying it with the intensity of someone trying to memorize a face he'd never seen in life. "Mom, show them the letters." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. She disappeared upstairs, returning with a shoebox that had clearly been handled countless times over the decades. Inside were dozens of letters, envelopes worn soft from reading and rereading, pages carefully preserved despite their age. "These are every letter Danny wrote home from Vietnam," Sarah explained, setting the box on the coffee table like an offering. "I've read them so many times I could recite them from memory. But there are gaps. Things he couldn't say in letters home, things that needed explaining." She pulled out a letter dated March 1968, just weeks before Danny's death. "Listen to this. Sarah, I've been thinking about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of man I want our baby to know I was. There's this guy in my unit, Harry Mitchell from Missouri, and he's teaching me things I never learned growing up without a dad. How to tie knots that won't slip, how to read the sky for weather, how to keep your promises even when it costs you everything you have." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. He'd never known Danny wrote about him, never imagined he'd mattered enough to mention in letters home to the woman who owned his heart. Sarah continued reading, her voice steady despite the tears. "Harry's got this way about him. Quiet strength, Mom would have called it. He doesn't talk much about home, but I can tell he's got good people waiting for him. The kind of man who'd give you his last cigarette without thinking about it, who'd carry a wounded friend 5 miles if that's what it took. If something happens to me over here, I hope you get to meet him someday. I think you'd like each other." The room went completely silent except for the grandfather clock and the sound of hearts breaking and healing simultaneously. Harold felt 55 years of self-hatred cracking like ice in spring, revealing something underneath that might have been hope. "He wrote about me," Harold whispered, incredulous. "In almost every letter after you two met," Michael said, returning to sit beside his mother with his father's photograph still in his hands. "Mom used to read them to me when I was little before bedtime. I grew up hearing stories about Harry Mitchell, the quiet soldier who looked after my dad in the jungle." Sarah pulled out another letter, this one dated just 2 weeks before the ambush. "This one's my favorite. I had the strangest dream last night, Sarah. I dreamed I was old, maybe 70 or 80, sitting on a porch somewhere watching our grandchildren play in the yard. And Harry was there too, old and gray like me. And we were laughing about something that happened when we were young and foolish and thought we were going to live forever. When I woke up, I felt peaceful for the first time since I got to this godforsaken place, like maybe everything was going to work out the way it's supposed to, even if we can't see how yet." Harold felt something break loose in his chest, something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He dreamed about growing old together. "He loved you, Harold," Sarah said simply. "Not the way he loved me, but the way brothers love each other, the way family loves family. And that love didn't die with him. It lived in you, in that piece of metal your body kept safe all these years." Linda stood up suddenly, moving to kneel beside Harold's chair. "Daddy, don't you see? You did keep your promise. You carried Danny home, literally carried him in your body for 55 years. And now you've brought him back to his family, brought his love and his last words and his dreams back to the people who needed to hear them." Thomas joined his sister, placing a gentle hand on their father's shoulder. "Pop, remember what you used to tell us when we were kids? That love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. You chose to love Danny Sullivan's memory every day for 55 years. That's not failure. That's the longest love story I've ever heard." Robert, ever the doctor, ever the practical one, wiped his eyes and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrison, Michael, what happens now? Where do we go from here?" Sarah looked at the fragment on the coffee table, then at Harold, then at the photograph of her son holding his father's picture. "Now we heal," she said simply. "All of us, together. We've carried this pain separately for too long." Michael set down his father's photograph and extended his hand to Harold. "Mr. Mitchell, Harold, I'd like you to stay for dinner. I'd like you to meet my wife and kids, your grandchildren and all but blood. I'd like them to hear about their grandfather from the man who knew him best." Harold stared at the offered hand, seeing in Michael's face the ghost of the boy Danny Sullivan had dreamed about teaching to throw a curveball, seeing the man his friend would have been proud to call son. Slowly, with hands that shook like autumn leaves, he reached out and clasped Michael's fingers. "I'd like that," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in 55 years. "I'd like that very much." Outside, Buffalo settled into evening, streetlights flickering on like candles in church windows. Inside, two families separated by decades of grief and misunderstanding began the slow work of becoming one family united by love and loss and the promises we keep to the dead. The fragment sat on Sarah's coffee table, catching the lamplight like a star, no longer a burden or an accusation but a bridge between past and present, between the young soldier who died loving his family and the old man who'd finally found the courage to deliver that love home. Danny Sullivan was finally at peace. And for the first time in 55 years, so was Harold Mitchell. 1 year later, on a crisp Memorial Day morning that smelled of fresh flowers and promise, Harold Mitchell stood at Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery with his arm around Sarah Morrison's shoulders, watching 3 generations of family gather around Danny Sullivan's white marble headstone. The inscription was simple: name, rank, dates of birth and death. But the love surrounding it was infinite. Michael's wife, Jennifer, had driven down from Buffalo with their 2 children. 8-year-old Daniel Harold Morrison, named for both his grandfather and the man who'd carried him home, and 5-year-old Margaret Sarah Morrison, whose middle name honored both Danny's mother and the woman who'd waited 56 years to hear his final words. They stood quietly beside the grave, small hands clutching the wild flowers they'd picked from Sarah's garden that morning. Harold's own family had made the journey from Missouri. Robert, with his teenage sons who were just beginning to understand the weight of family legacy. Linda with her husband and daughter who'd spent the drive asking questions about the grandfather they'd never known they had. And Thomas with his wife and twin boys who would grow up knowing that promises matter, even when they take a lifetime to keep. "Grandpa Harold," little Daniel Morrison said, tugging on Harold's sleeve with the insistence of a child who'd inherited his grandfather's determination. "Tell us again about Grandpa Danny and the curveball." Harold knelt down to the boy's level, his 74-year-old knees protesting but his heart soaring at being called Grandpa by Danny Sullivan's grandson. "Well, your real Grandpa Danny was the best pitcher in all of Buffalo before he went to the Army. Could throw a curveball that would make grown men cry." "Will you teach me?" Daniel asked, his green eyes, Danny's eyes, passed down through generations like a blessing, bright with hope. "I'd be honored to, son. Though I should warn you, I learned everything I know about baseball from your grandpa, so if I mess it up, you can blame him." Harold's voice carried the easy humor that had taken him 74 years to find, the peace that comes from finally understanding that some burdens are meant to be shared. Sarah squeezed his arm, her own eyes bright with tears that were equal parts grief and joy. They'd become an unlikely pair over the past year, 2 septuagenarians who'd found in each other not romance but something deeper. The comfort of shared understanding, the peace of mutual forgiveness, the joy of watching families blend like watercolors in rain. "Danny would have loved this," she whispered, watching her daughter-in-law help Margaret arrange flowers while Robert's boys peppered Michael with questions about their newfound uncle. "All of us together, all these children who carry pieces of him forward." The story of Harold's 56-year journey had become something of a national phenomenon, shared first on social media with the hashtag #CarryingTheWeight, then picked up by news outlets hungry for stories of redemption in an age of division. The CBS Evening News segment had been viewed 12 million times, spawning copycat stories about other veterans finally finding the courage to deliver long-delayed messages, creating support groups for families of the fallen who'd spent decades with unanswered questions. Dr. Benjamin Waters had parlayed the attention into funding for a research project studying the long-term psychological effects of survivor's guilt while also establishing the Danny Sullivan Memorial Fund to help veterans' families connect with each other across the decades of silence that war creates. The fragment itself now lived in a place of honor in the Smithsonian's newest exhibit on the human cost of the Vietnam War, accompanied by the full story of 2 families united by love and loss and the promises we make to the dying. But for Harold, the real miracle wasn't the national attention or the research funding or even the museum display. The real miracle was sitting around Sarah's dining room table every Sunday, watching his grandchildren and Danny's grandchildren argue over who got the last piece of pie, listening to stories about school and sports, and all the small dramas that make up a life lived in peace. Michael had become the son Harold never knew he'd lost when Danny died, and Harold had become the father Michael had spent 55 years missing. They'd discovered a shared love of baseball and old cars, and the kind of quiet conversations that happen between men who understand that some wounds never fully heal, but can still teach us how to love. "I have something for you," Sarah said, pulling a small, wrapped package from her purse. "I was going to wait until we got back to the house, but this feels like the right moment." Harold unwrapped the gift carefully, his hands still shaking slightly, but no longer from fear or guilt, from age and emotion and the overwhelming gratitude of a man who'd been given a second chance at family. Inside was a small silver picture frame containing a photograph he'd never seen before. Danny Sullivan and Harold Mitchell, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like the young men they'd been before war taught them the true cost of brotherhood. "Where did you find this?" Harold asked, his voice thick with wonder. "Michael found it in a box of his father's things we'd stored in the attic. Apparently Danny sent it home with one of his last letters, told me to keep it safe because someday I'd understand why it was important." Sarah's smile was radiant, the expression of a woman who'd finally found the missing piece of a puzzle she'd been working on for more than half a century. Harold stared at the photograph, remembering the day it was taken, a rare moment of lightness during their last week together, when they'd found a camera abandoned by fleeing civilians and decided to document their friendship for posterity. Danny had insisted on the photo, said he wanted proof that even in hell good men could find each other. "He knew," Harold whispered. "Somehow, he knew you'd need this." The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the cemetery, where 400,000 Americans lay buried, each white stone marking not just a life ended, but a family forever changed. Children played in the distance, their laughter carrying on the wind like music, like hope, like the sound of promises kept across the generations. As they prepared to leave, each family member placed a hand on Danny's headstone, adding their own silent prayers to the stone that had absorbed 56 years of grief and love and longing. Harold was the last to touch the marble, his fingers tracing the letters of his friend's name with the reverence of someone who understood that some connections transcend death. "Rest easy, brother," he whispered. "Your boy turned out fine, better than fine, and your grandbabies. God, Danny, they've got your eyes and your smile and your stubborn streak. You'd be so proud." The wind picked up, rustling the flowers and flags that marked Memorial Day, and for just a moment Harold could swear he heard laughter, young and joyous and infinitely familiar, the sound of Danny Sullivan finally at peace. They walked back to their cars as an extended family, arms linked across generations, carrying forward the love that death couldn't diminish and time couldn't erase. Behind them, the fragment of a dog tag rested in the Smithsonian, but the real memorial walked away on 4 legs and 24 feet, a living testament to the truth that love, once given, never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to come home. Harold Mitchell was finally free, and Danny Sullivan's promise of eternal friendship had been kept in ways neither young soldier could have imagined in that jungle 56 years ago. Some loves are worth carrying forever, and some promises are worth a lifetime to fulfill. Message for American seniors, 200 words. Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't physical. They're the promises we made, the words left unsaid, the connections we thought were lost forever. Harold Mitchell spent 55 years carrying a piece of his fallen friend, believing he'd failed in his duty to honor a dying soldier's last wish. But what he discovered at 73 changed everything. It's never too late to keep a promise, never too late to heal a wounded heart, and never too late to find the family you thought you'd lost. In a world that often feels divided, Harold's story reminds us that love transcends time, that brotherhood survives death, and that the connections forged in our youth can still warm us in our golden years. Whether it's reaching out to an old friend, sharing a long-held secret, or simply choosing forgiveness over resentment, we all have fragments of our past waiting to be healed. The question isn't whether we deserve grace, it's whether we're brave enough to accept it. Questions for engagement. What promise from your past still weighs on your heart, and what would it take to find peace with it? Have you ever discovered that carrying pain actually carried love all along? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.